They say silence is golden, but in the opulent, sun-drenched halls of the De Luca estate, silence was something far more complex. It was a currency, traded in unspoken threats and shared glances. It was a weapon wielded by the matriarch Isabella to control her domain with an iron will. And for a time, it was a shield for a young maid named Elena, a girl who polished their silver and quietly absorbed their secrets. But for her, silence was also a promise of a storm that was gathering strength not in the turbulent sky, but in the patient, observant heart of a woman who had been wronged. And on this day, the storm had finally arrived, not with thunder and lightning, but with the polite, civilized violence of a high-end auction. The great De Luca mansion, a testament to generations of power, was on the block, its soul for sale to the highest bidder. There they stood, the last of the De Lucas, huddled together like shipwreck survivors on a shrinking island of their own making. Isabella, once a queen in her castle, now looked like a marble statue cracking from within. Her son, Julian, the golden boy whose charm had been the catalyst for so much pain, was a pale, hollowed-out version of his former self. And his wife, Chloe, her face a mask of disbelief, her designer dress unable to hide the brittle fear in her eyes. Amidst the whispers and hesitant bids, one figure remained serene, a pillar of calm in the swirling sea of their ruin. A woman in a flawlessly tailored suit, her face partially obscured by a delicate, black-netted veil. She outbid every hopeful tycoon, every legacy hunter, with a quiet, unyielding determination. Her voice, when she spoke her bid, was calm, measured, cutting through the tension like a shard of ice. No one knew who she was. She was a ghost from a future the De Lucas never thought would exist. As the auctioneer's voice crescendoed, going once, going twice, the world around Elena faded. The scent of old money and new desperation was replaced by the phantom smell of rain on cold stone. She wasn't seeing the auctioneer's hammer. She was seeing the heavy oak door of this very house slamming shut in her face. She felt the icy sting of the downpour that soaked her thin uniform, the gut-wrenching despair of a young, pregnant girl, betrayed and cast out by the very man who had sworn to love her. His cruel, cowardly words echoed louder than any bid. The hammer fell with a sharp, final crack. Sold to the lady in the veil. A collective gasp filled the room. Elena stood, her posture perfect, her breathing even. The house was hers. The silence that followed was deafening, but this time it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't a weapon to be used against her. This time, the silence belonged to her. Before she was a specter at an auction, before she was a name whispered in fear on the stock exchange, Elena was just a girl with a single worn suitcase and a heart full of carefully managed hope. The iron gates of the De Luca estate did not swing open for her. They were opened by a guard who barely glanced at her face, his eyes cataloging her simple dress and worn-out shoes as a clear indicator of her station. The gravel driveway crunched under her feet, each step taking her further away from the world she knew and deeper into a realm she had only ever seen in magazines. The mansion wasn't just a house, it was a declaration. It rose from the perfectly manicured lawns like a mountain of limestone and glass, its windows watching her approach like 100 unblinking eyes. It was designed to intimidate, to remind all who entered of their own insignificance in the face of such generational wealth. Elena, an orphan who had aged out of the foster care system with little more than her own sharp mind and a fierce will to survive, felt that insignificance with every fiber of her being. Her plan was simple, almost painfully so. Work for 2 years, save every penny, and then enroll in college. This house was not a home, it was a stepping stone, a temporary sacrifice for a future she was determined to build for herself. Inside, the air was different. It was still and cool, smelling faintly of lemon polish, old leather, and money so old it had its own fragrance. A stern, unsmiling woman named Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper, met her in the grand marble foyer. Her words were clipped and precise, laying out the rules that governed this universe. Elena was to be invisible. She was to see everything and say nothing. Her job was to erase any sign of human imperfection. A fingerprint on a glass, a crease in a bedsheet, a speck of dust on the gleaming mahogany floors. She was a ghost in the machine of the DeLuca's perfect life. In those first few weeks, Elena learned the geography of the mansion. She knew the path from the servants' quarters in the basement to the sprawling kitchens, the labyrinth of hallways that led to the family's private wings, the way the afternoon sun slanted through the two-story windows of the great room, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny diamonds in the air. But more importantly, she began to learn the geography of the family itself. Isabella DeLuca was the undisputed monarch of this kingdom. She was a tall, unnervingly elegant woman who moved through the halls with a silent, predatory grace. She never raised her voice. She didn't have to. A single, disappointed glance from her cool gray eyes was enough to make a seasoned staff member tremble. She would inspect Elena's work not by looking at it, but by sensing it, running a white-gloved finger over a surface she knew should be clean, her expression unreadable. To Isabella, the staff were not people. They were functions, extensions of the house itself, and Elena was simply the new function for dusting and scrubbing. Then there was Chloe, Julian's fiancée. If Isabella's power was a glacier, vast and silently crushing, Chloe's was a shard of ice, sharp and intended to draw blood. She was beautiful in a brittle, expensive way, and she carried an air of bored entitlement. She seemed to take a particular petty pleasure in reminding Elena of her place. She would drop a linen napkin on the floor and watch, with a smirk, as Elena stooped to retrieve it. She would ask for a glass of water and then complain it was not the right temperature, leaving it untouched on a coaster. She never looked at Elena. She looked through her, as if she were a particularly uninteresting piece of furniture. Chloe was a gatekeeper, zealously guarding the shimmering walls of her social stratosphere from anyone she deemed unworthy. And then there was Julian. He was the sun in this cold, ornate solar system. The first time Elena saw him, he was striding through the foyer, talking animatedly on his phone about a merger, his voice confident and full of life. He stopped mid-sentence, catching her eye as she stood pressed against the wall, trying to make herself smaller. He paused his conversation, a warm, genuine smile spreading across his face, and simply said, "Welcome. I don't think we've been introduced. I'm Julian." The simple act of acknowledgement, of seeing her as a person, was so startling in the oppressive atmosphere of the house that Elena could only stammer a reply. He was everything his mother and fiancé were not: warm, approachable, seemingly kind. He treated the staff with a casual respect that made them fiercely loyal to him. He remembered their names, asked about their families. To Elena, who had known so little kindness in her life, these small gestures felt like a lifeline. As weeks turned into months, Elena's invisibility became her greatest asset. She was a silent witness to the inner workings of the DeLuca dynasty. While cleaning Julian's vast, book-lined study, she would hear snippets of his world through discarded notes and phone calls. She heard names of corporations, stock tickers, whispers of hostile takeovers and strategic alliances. The words were a foreign language to her, but her mind, hungry for knowledge, filed them away like a diligent archivist. She saw the casual, almost obscene wealth firsthand. She packed away Chloe's barely worn designer dresses, worth more than Elena could hope to earn in a year. She cleared away half-eaten plates of food so exotic and expensive it made her stomach ache with a strange mix of anger and longing. But she also saw the cracks in the gilded facade. She saw the forced smiles at the dinner table, the way Isabella's jaw would tighten when Julian disagreed with her on a business matter. She witnessed the aftermath of arguments she never heard, a shattered glass in the library, a tense, suffocating silence that hung in the air for hours. She noticed Julian's easygoing smile would often vanish the moment his mother entered a room, replaced by a shadow of frustration and filial duty. He was the golden son, the heir apparent, but Elena began to realize he was also a prisoner, bound by the heavy chains of his own last name. The DeLuca family, from the outside, was an impenetrable fortress of success and power. But from the inside, Elena could see the truth. It was a house of secrets, of resentments, of quiet desperation, all held together by the cold, unyielding will of its matriarch. And in the heart of this beautiful, lonely prison, Elena worked and watched, saving her money and learning lessons she never would have found in a college classroom, all the while unaware that the one spark of warmth she had found in Julian's smile was not a lifeline, but the bait in a trap that was slowly closing around her. The change was subtle at first, a slow thaw in the glacial formality of the DeLuca mansion. It began not with words, but with looks. When Elena served dinner, Julian's eyes would linger on her for a fraction of a second too long, a silent acknowledgement that separated her from the wallpaper she was meant to be. When she passed him in the hall, the polite, dismissive nod he gave the other staff was replaced, for her, with a small, almost conspiratorial smile. These were tiny gestures, insignificant to anyone else, but to a girl starved of human connection, they were like sparks in a vast darkness. He began to orchestrate encounters, engineering moments that felt like chance. He would appear in the library late at night when he knew she was doing her final dusting, a book in his hand as a pretense. He wouldn't speak to her at first, but his presence filled the cavernous room, creating a shared, silent space that felt separate from the rest of the house. One evening, as she was polishing the ornate wooden globe in the corner, he finally broke the silence. "Have you ever wanted to travel?" he asked, his voice soft. Elena was so startled she nearly dropped her cloth. No one in this house ever asked what she wanted. I hope to, someday," she stammered, her eyes fixed on the continent of Africa. "I want to see the world before I decide which part of it I want to study." Julian moved closer, his expensive cologne cutting through the scent of lemon oil. "Study?" he asked, his curiosity genuine. "That's my plan," Elena said, a bit of her old resolve returning to her voice. "I'm working here to save for college. I want to study international business." A slow smile spread across Julian's face. "International business," he repeated, sounding impressed. "My mother would approve of the ambition, at least." There was a hint of bitterness in his tone that Elena had never heard before. That night, for the first time, he spoke to her not as the master of the house speaks to a maid, but as one person confiding in another. He spoke of the suffocating weight of his family name, the relentless pressure from his mother to be a DeLuca first and a man second. He painted his engagement to Chloe not as a romance, but as a corporate merger, a strategic alliance between two dynasties. This became their ritual. Their secret world was confined to the quiet, forgotten corners of the estate, blossoming under the cover of darkness. They met in the vast, silent library, surrounded by the stories of 1,000 other lives as they began to write their own. He would wait for her, and she would find him, and for a few stolen hours, the rigid hierarchy of the house would melt away. He listened to her. It was his greatest weapon and her greatest weakness. He didn't just hear her speak of her dreams. He asked questions. He encouraged them. He made them feel valid. He told her she was too smart, too full of life, to spend her years dusting other people's memories. He made her feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. Elena, who had built walls around her heart to survive, found them crumbling away with every shared secret, every stolen glance. She knew it was dangerous, a foolish, impossible fantasy. But his attention was an intoxicating poison, and she drank it down willingly. The gardens became another sanctuary. One moonlit night, he led her out to the greenhouse at the far end of the property, a crystal palace filled with the humid scent of orchids and night-blooming jasmine. Here, away from the portraits of his ancestors and the watchful eyes of the house, he was different. He was just a man, and she was just a woman. He told her about his own buried dreams of being an architect, of wanting to build things rather than just inherit them. He showed her a sketchbook filled with drawings he had hidden since he was a teenager. It was a calculated act of vulnerability designed to make her trust him, to make her feel special, and it worked perfectly. She found herself falling not just for the charming air, but for the trapped artist she believed was hidden inside. She began to see herself not as a complication in his life, but as the key to his liberation. The romance deepened, becoming a fever in her blood. The risk of being discovered only heightened the thrill. A brief touch of hands as she served him coffee, a note left for her inside a book she was meant to reshelve, a shared look across a crowded dining room that felt like a shout. Elena's world, once small and focused on a single, practical goal, was now entirely consumed by him. Her dream of college didn't vanish, but it was transformed, folded into a new, grander dream that he was carefully constructing for them both. The peak of his artistry came one rainy evening in the library. He had built a small fire, and the room was filled with a warm, golden glow. He took her hands in his expression serious, his voice a low, earnest murmur. "This can't go on forever, Elena," he began, and her heart plummeted. But then he continued, "Not like this, not in the shadows." He laid out a beautiful, impossible future. He would take on more responsibility at the company, he explained, prove his competence to his mother and the board. Once he had solidified his power, he would be immune to her control. He would break off the engagement to Chloe, which he swore was already falling apart. He would tell his mother the truth, and she would have no choice but to accept it. "She'll be furious," he said with a dramatic sigh, "but she cares about the company more than anything. She won't risk a public scandal by disowning me once I'm indispensable." He painted a picture of a life in a different city, maybe San Francisco or Chicago. In a modern penthouse he would design himself. A life where she could go to school, and he would be free, and they would be together, away from the poison of his family. He made it sound so logical, so achievable. He wasn't just selling a dream, he was presenting a business plan for their happiness. And Elena, her heart overflowing with love for this man who she believed was risking everything for her, bought every word. As she left him that night, her mind spinning with the beautiful future he had promised, she passed Isabella's study. The door was slightly ajar, and for a moment, Elena could see her, not reading or working, but simply staring at a portrait of her late husband, her face a mask of cold, unyielding ambition. A chill that had nothing to do with the rain outside crept down Elena's spine. It was a fleeting, unspoken warning, a reminder that the world he had promised and the world that actually existed were separated by the will of that one formidable woman. But she pushed the feeling down. Hope, after all, was a far warmer companion than fear. The first sign was a subtle betrayal by her own body. A wave of exhaustion that hit her in the middle of the afternoon, so profound she had to brace herself against a wall while polishing the grand staircase. Then came the strange new sensitivity to smells, the scent of the bleach used on the marble floors suddenly becoming overwhelmingly harsh, the rich aroma of coffee from the kitchen turning her stomach. Elena, ever practical, initially dismissed it as fatigue, the result of long hours and the constant, low-level stress of living a double life. But when the final, undeniable sign confirmed a truth her heart had refused to acknowledge, the world tilted on its axis. In the sterile silence of her small, windowless bathroom in the servants' quarters, two faint pink lines on a small plastic stick shattered her carefully constructed reality. Her dream of college, the very reason she had entered this house, dissolved like mist. Her future, once a straight, clear path she was paving with her own hard work, now fractured into a million terrifying, uncertain possibilities. Fear was the first emotion, a cold, metallic taste in her mouth. She thought of her own childhood, of growing up without a mother or father, a life defined by a sense of being utterly alone. She would be fired instantly, cast out with nothing, and her child would be born into that same loneliness. The thought was unbearable. But then, another feeling, quieter and far more powerful, began to surface. As she placed a trembling hand on her still flat stomach, a fierce, primal wave of protectiveness washed over her. This was not an abstract problem anymore. This was a life, her child, their child. And with that thought, fear began to coexist with a fragile, dangerous hope. Perhaps this wasn't the end of her dream, but the beginning of a new one, a dream she had never been brave enough to imagine. This secret, this tiny, growing life, could be the very thing that made their fantasy a reality. It had to be. Telling Julian was the single most terrifying thing she had ever done. She waited for their next meeting in the greenhouse, the air thick and sweet with the scent of orchids. Each tick of the grandfather clock in the distant hall sounded like a hammer blow against her ribs. When he finally arrived, smiling his easy smile, the words caught in her throat. He saw the look on her face and his own expression changed, concern replacing his usual warmth. "Elena, what is it? What's wrong?" He took her hands, his touch both a comfort and a torment. She couldn't meet his eyes. Staring at a single, perfect white orchid, she whispered the words into the humid air. "I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was absolute. It stretched for an eternity, thick and heavy. And in that moment, Elena's fragile hope began to crumble into dust. She braced herself for the anger, the denial, the cold dismissal. But it never came. Instead, she felt his fingers tighten around hers. She risked a glance at his face and saw not anger, but a look of stunned, wide-eyed awe. A slow smile spread across his lips, transforming his face. "Pregnant?" he breathed, the word full of wonder. "Are you sure?" She could only nod, tears finally spilling from her eyes. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, his heart thumping against her ear. "Elena, this is everything." He pulled back, his hands framing her face, his eyes searching hers. "This changes everything, for the better." He knelt before her, placing a gentle, reverent hand on her stomach. "Our baby," he whispered, looking up at her. "An heir." The word hung in the air, clinical and strange. He saw the flicker of confusion on her face and quickly softened his tone. "This is our family, starting right now." He rose and held her again, his voice now filled with a new strategic excitement. He began to spin her terror into triumph. "Don't you see? This is the answer," he said, his words coming in a rush. "This is our leverage. A grandchild, an heir to the DeLuca name. My mother, she's obsessed with legacy. She can't fight this. A scandal would be one thing, but a legitimate heir is another. It's the one thing she can't argue with." He made it sound like a masterstroke, a brilliant strategic move in the silent war against his mother. But his solution came with a condition. "We have to be smart," he insisted, his tone shifting from romantic to conspiratorial. "The timing has to be perfect. I'm closing the Atherton deal next month. It's the biggest acquisition in the company's history. It will make me untouchable. Once that's done, once I am the future of this company in a way no one can deny, then we tell her. We'll be in a position of strength. To tell her now would be a catastrophe. She'd see it as a weakness, a distraction. She'd find a way to handle it, to handle you." The unspoken threat hung between them. He took her hands again. "Can you do that for us, Elena? Can you keep our secret just a little longer? I need you to trust me. This is our only move." He had transformed her reality into a chess game and made her silence the most critical piece on the board. Overwhelmed, in love, and desperate to believe, she agreed. Her silence became her vow of loyalty, her proof of faith in the future he promised. But they were not the only two players in the game. In the weeks that followed, a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere of the mansion. Isabella DeLuca, who had previously regarded Elena with dismissive indifference, now began to watch her. It was never overt, never anything Elena could point to, but she felt it constantly, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck. Isabella's cool gray eyes would find her across a room and hold her gaze for a moment too long. While making her rounds, the matriarch would appear silently in a doorway, observing Elena as she dusted a portrait, her expression unreadable. She started asking Mrs. Gable pointedly casual questions. "Does the girl Elena seem tired to you lately? Her work in the West Wing has been a little less than perfect. Perhaps she isn't feeling well." One afternoon, as Elena was leaving the greenhouse after a brief, stolen moment with Julian, she saw Isabella standing on the high balcony of her bedroom, a motionless silhouette against the sky, looking directly down at her. She felt pinned by that gaze, like a specimen under a microscope. The house, their sanctuary, was beginning to feel like a cage, and Elena had the distinct, terrifying feeling that the zookeeper was watching her every move, her patience wearing thin. She was guarding a secret that was growing every day, clinging to the promises of a man she loved, all while living under the roof of a woman who was beginning to look at her not as a servant, but as an infestation.
Tôi đã hoàn thành phần 2,30 theo yêu cầu của bạn ở tin nhắn ngay trước đây. Có thể đã có lỗi xảy ra,
khiến bạn không nhận được nó. Tôi xin phép gửi lại nội dung chi tiết của phần 2,30 một lần nữa. Sau khi bạn xem xong, hãy cho tôi biết nếu bạn muốn tôi tiếp tục với phần 2,40. Phần 2,30. Lời hứa và bí mật động trời. The first sign was a subtle betrayal by her own body. A wave of exhaustion that hit her in the middle of the afternoon, so profound she had to brace herself against a wall while polishing the grand staircase. Then came the strange new sensitivity to smells. The scent of the bleach used on the marble floors suddenly becoming overwhelmingly harsh. The rich aroma of coffee from the kitchen turning her stomach. Elena, ever practical, initially dismissed it as fatigue, the result of long hours and the constant low-level stress of living a double life. But when the final, undeniable sign confirmed a truth her heart had refused to acknowledge, the world tilted on its axis. In the sterile silence of her small, windowless bathroom in the servants' quarters, two faint pink lines on a small plastic stick shattered her carefully constructed reality. Her dream of college, the very reason she had entered this house, dissolved like mist. Her future, once a straight, clear path she was paving with her own hard work, now fractured into a million terrifying, uncertain possibilities. Fear was the first emotion, a cold, metallic taste in her mouth. She thought of her own childhood, of growing up without a mother or father, a life defined by a sense of being utterly alone. She would be fired instantly, cast out with nothing, and her child would be born into that same loneliness. The thought was unbearable. But then, another feeling, quieter and far more powerful, began to surface. As she placed a trembling hand on her still flat stomach, a fierce, primal wave of protectiveness washed over her. This was not an abstract problem anymore. This was a life, her child, their child. And with that thought, fear began to coexist with a fragile, dangerous hope. Perhaps this wasn't the end of her dream, but the beginning of a new one, a dream she had never been brave enough to imagine. This secret, this tiny, growing life, could be the very thing that made their fantasy a reality. It had to be. Telling Julian was the single most terrifying thing she had ever done. She waited for their next meeting in the greenhouse, the air thick and sweet with the scent of orchids. Each tick of the grandfather clock in the distant hall sounded like a hammer blow against her ribs. When he finally arrived, smiling his easy smile, the words caught in her throat. He saw the look on her face, and his own expression changed, concern replacing his usual warmth. "Elena, what is it? What's wrong?" He took her hands, his touch both a comfort and a torment. She couldn't meet his eyes. Staring at a single, perfect white orchid, she whispered the words into the humid air. "I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was absolute. It stretched for an eternity, thick and heavy, and in that moment, Elena's fragile hope began to crumble into dust. She braced herself for the anger, the denial, the cold dismissal, but it never came. Instead, she felt his fingers tighten around hers. She risked a glance at his face and saw not anger, but a look of stunned, wide-eyed awe. A slow smile spread across his lips, transforming his face. "Pregnant?" he breathed, the word full of wonder. "Are you sure?" She could only nod, tears finally spilling from her eyes. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, his heart thumping against her ear. "Elena, this is everything." He pulled back, his hands framing her face, his eyes searching hers. "This changes everything. For the better." The trap was not sprung with a shout, but with a quiet, chilling summons. Elena was in the laundry room, folding a set of warm, lavender-scented sheets, the mundane task, a small comfort in her increasingly anxious world. "Mrs. Gable appeared in the doorway, her face unusually pale, her lips pressed into a thin, hard line. "Mrs. DeLuca wishes to see you, Elena," the housekeeper said, her voice devoid of its usual clipped authority, replaced now with something that sounded unnervingly like pity. In the main drawing room, at once, the drawing room, a cold knot of dread formed in Elena's stomach. It was the heart of the house, the formal, museum-like space reserved for important guests and family announcements. In her entire time at the estate, Elena had only ever been in that room to dust its cold marble mantelpiece and polish its lifeless silver ornaments. To be summoned, there was not a request, it was a court summons. Every step she took on the plush runner of the grand hallway felt unnaturally loud, a drumbeat marching her towards her own execution. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She instinctively placed a hand over her stomach, a silent promise to the life within her that she would be strong. When she pushed open the heavy, ornate door, the scene that greeted her was worse than anything she could have imagined. It was a perfectly staged tableau of judgment. Isabella was seated on the silk damask sofa, her posture as rigid and unyielding as a queen on her throne. Beside her, Chloe was perched on the edge of her seat, a smug, predatory gleam in her eyes, like a cat watching a cornered mouse. But it was the third figure that made the air leave Elena's lungs. Julian. He was standing by the massive stone fireplace, his back partially turned, staring into the empty hearth as if hoping it would swallow him whole. He looked pale and haggard, and when he briefly, guiltily, met her eyes, he flinched away as if she were the Sunday he already knew. He had already surrendered. Elena was left standing alone in the center of the vast, silent room, the colossal space making her feel smaller and more vulnerable than ever before. Isabella let the silence stretch, using it as an instrument of terror. Finally, she spoke, her voice not loud, but low and laced with a cold, clear venom that cut deeper than any shout. "We have a problem, it seems," she began, gesturing to the small mahogany table in front of her. On it lay a small, folded piece of paper, a receipt from a pharmacy in the next town over, for prenatal vitamins, an infestation in the house, a parasite, to be more precise, one that seeks to attach itself to a healthy host and bleed it dry. Her gray eyes bored into Elena's, devoid of any human emotion. "Tell me, girl, did you truly believe your sordid little plan would work? Did you think you could creep into this family through my son's weakness and your own base cunning? Did you look at this legacy, this name, everything we have built over a century, and see nothing but a lottery ticket for a common creature like yourself?" Every word was a carefully aimed dart, dipped in the poison of class and contempt. Elena's mind reeled. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but her throat was tight with shock. Chloe, sensing her moment, chimed in, her voice a high, mocking counterpoint to Isabella's icy baritone. "Oh, do be quiet, Isabella. You're scaring her," she cooed, a cruel smile playing on her lips. She turned her attention to Elena, her eyes raking over her simple uniform with disdain. "You poor, naive thing. Did you actually believe all those pretty words he whispered to you in the dark? Did you think a few stolen kisses in the garden made you his equal? Julian has a taste for the exotic, for charity cases. It's a flaw, but a manageable one. You were a distraction, a little game. To think you could ever be anything more." She let out a laugh, a sharp, ugly sound in the pristine room. My God, the arrogance is almost impressive. The carefully constructed world of love and promises that Elena had cherished was being systematically dismantled, burned to the ground before her very eyes. Tears welled, hot and shameful, but she refused to let them fall. There was only one person in this room who could stop this, only one person who owed her the truth. Her eyes locked on Julian, pleading with him, begging him to say something, to deny their lies, to honor the life they had created. All of his promises, his whispered plans for their future, his declarations of love, all of it funneled down into this one singular moment. "Say something, please. Julian, be the man I love." Isabella followed her gaze, a look of triumph on her face. "Yes, Julian," she commanded, her voice like the crack of a whip. "The girl seems to be under some sort of delusion. Why don't you clarify the situation for her? Tell her the truth." Julian finally turned, but he couldn't meet Elena's gaze. His eyes were fixed on a point on the wall just over her shoulder. His face was a mask of pale, sweating misery. When he spoke, his voice was a hoarse, unrecognizable whisper, the words of a coward saving his own skin. "It's not what she thinks," he stammered, twisting a ring on his finger. She was always there. She made it clear she was interested. I felt sorry for her, that's all. Her life. It's been so hard." He was trying to paint himself as a compassionate soul, a philanthropist of affection. "It was a mistake," he continued, the words gathering a pathetic momentum. A moment of weakness. It meant nothing. I was never going to leave Chloe. This was all. A fantasy of hers. Elena felt a physical blow, as if he had struck her across the face. The air turned to ice in her lungs. The love, the intimacy, the shared vulnerability, he had just erased it all, rewriting their history into a cheap, sordid affair of his pity and her ambition. And then came the final, soul-destroying betrayal. He looked at his mother, a supplicant begging for forgiveness. And the situation she claims. How can I even be sure? A girl like that. Who knows who else there might have been? That was it. That was the sound of a heart shattering. The sounds of the room, Chloe's triumphant little sigh, Isabella's coolly satisfied breathing, Julian's ragged gasp all faded into a dull, distant roar. A strange, terrifying calm washed over Elena. The pain was so immense, so absolute, that it circled back on itself and became numbness. The tears that had threatened to fall moments ago froze in her ducts. The fire of her love and the terror of her situation were both extinguished, replaced by something cold, hard, and heavy. She looked at the three of them, her tormentors, her judges, her executioners. She saw them now for what they were, a monster, a fool, and a coward. She didn't say a word. There were no words left. She simply stood there in the center of the room, her spine straight, her expression an utter and complete blank. The naive girl with a heart full of hope had died in that room. And in the silent, icy ruins of her devastation, something new, something patient and unforgiving, was beginning to take root. The numbness that had encased Elena in the drawing room was a fragile shield, and it shattered the moment Isabella spoke her final verdict. With a dismissive wave of her hand, she looked not at Elena, but at the grim-faced Mrs. Gable. Remove her from the property. Immediately, have security escort her to the gate. She is not to take anything but the bag she arrived with. Her final week's wages will be forfeited as a cleaning fee for the moral stain she has left on this house. There was no appeal, no room for argument. It was an erasure. 2 security guards, men whose polite nods she had acknowledged 100 times, appeared at her elbows. They did not touch her, but their presence was a cage, guiding her on a final, silent walk of shame through the halls she had spent months polishing. The other staff members scurried out of their path, their eyes cast down, a mixture of fear and pity on their faces. They were ensuring their own survival, distancing themselves from the contagion of her disgrace. As the massive front door swung open, a gust of wind and rain blew in, a sudden, dramatic change in the weather that perfectly mirrored the violent upheaval of her life. They walked her down the long gravel driveway, the sky weeping for a sorrow she was still too shocked to feel. At the gate, she was told to wait. A few minutes later, a guard emerged from the house carrying her single worn suitcase. He did not hand it to her. On the explicit orders of the lady of the house, he let it drop onto the wet ground with a thud. The cheap latch burst open, spilling a few of her meager belongings, a book, a folded sweater, a photograph of the parents she never knew, into a muddy puddle. It was the final, calculated act of humiliation. Then, with a low metallic groan, the great iron gates of the DeLuca estate swung shut, locking her out of the world that had first promised her a future and had now stolen everything. The rain began to fall in earnest, a cold, relentless downpour that soaked her thin uniform in seconds. For a long time, Elena just stood there, staring at the golden D on the gate, the water plastering her hair to her face, and mixing with the silent tears she was finally beginning to shed. The words of her tormentors echoed in her head, a cruel cacophony. Isabella's parasite, Chloe's mocking laughter, and worst of all, Julian's pathetic, cowardly lies. The pain was a physical thing, a tightening in her chest, a sharp, twisting cramp deep in her belly. At first, she thought it was just the grief, a body reacting to a soul in agony. Clutching her stomach, she began to walk, with no destination in mind. Just a desperate need to put distance between herself and that house. She walked for what felt like hours, the opulent suburban streets eventually giving way to a grittier, more industrial part of town. The rain never let up. The world was a blur of smeared neon lights and rushing traffic, each passing car splashing her with cold, dirty water. With the last few dollars she had in her pocket, she found a motel. The sign outside had a flickering vacancy in a lurid pink, and the building itself seemed to sag with exhaustion and neglect. The room she was given was a universe away from the gilded cage she had just left. The wallpaper was peeling, revealing damp, stained plaster beneath. The air was thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and disinfectant. A single bare bulb cast a sickly yellow light over a bed with a thin, pockmarked coverlet. Through the grimy window, the neon sign buzzed and blinked, painting the room in pathetic, pulsing shades of pink and red. It was a room for people with no other place to go, a room for the forgotten. And as Elena locked the flimsy door behind her, she knew she had finally found a place that matched the utter ruin of her life. The cramping that had started at the gate was getting worse. It was no longer a dull ache but a sharp, rhythmic clenching, a hostile invasion within her own body. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. She curled up on the edge of the lumpy bed, wrapping her arms around her midsection, rocking back and forth as if to soothe a pain that was far beyond soothing. The physical agony was inextricably linked to her emotional torment. Each wave of pain brought with it a fresh wave of memory. Julian's face when he promised her forever, his gentle hand on her stomach when he called their child an heir, his empty eyes when he denied them both. The love she had felt, the hope she had nurtured, was now a poison, and her body was violently trying to expel it. She stumbled into the small, cold bathroom, the linoleum floor freezing against her bare feet. She looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror and saw a stranger, a pale, terrified girl with haunted eyes, her face streaked with rain and tears. And it was there, in the soul-crushing anonymity of that cheap motel bathroom, under the unforgiving glare of a single flickering bulb, that she lost everything. The pain crested in a final, agonizing wave, and with it, the last of her hope, the last of her love, the last piece of her future, was stolen from her. The hours that followed were a blur of a pain that was no longer sharp, but hollow. A vast, echoing emptiness had taken root where a life had once been. She eventually made her way back to the bed and collapsed, her body shivering uncontrollably, her mind mercifully blank. When she finally drifted into a fitful, haunted sleep, she didn't dream. To dream, you must have a future, and hers had been utterly and completely erased. She woke to a world that was unnervingly quiet. The rain had stopped. A bleak, gray morning light filtered through the dirty window. The neon sign was dead. For a moment, she lay perfectly still, listening to the silence. It was inside of her, too. The silence of a womb that was now empty. The silence of a heart that had been scoured clean of all softness. She was no longer a girl with a dream, a lover, a mother-to-be. She was nothing, a hollowed-out shell left to rust in a forgotten room. This was the bottom. This was the absolute zero point of her existence. And as she lay there in the cold, gray dawn, adrift in an ocean of loss, she was unaware that in the deepest, most desolate part of that emptiness, a single, hard, cold seed of fury was beginning to take root. For days, the world existed only in the smeared, gray frame of the cheap motel window. Elena existed in a state of suspended animation, a ghost haunting the few square feet of her own ruin. The hollow ache in her womb was a constant, physical reminder of the echoing emptiness in her soul. Grief was not a sharp, clean pain. It was a thick, suffocating fog that muted all thought, all feeling, all desire, except for the primal, animalistic need to simply keep breathing. Time lost its meaning. The buzzing of the neon sign at night bled into the bleak morning light. She was a ship adrift, her anchor cut, her sails torn, waiting for the current to finally pull her under. It was a flicker of old habit, of the responsible girl she used to be, that finally forced her out of the room. She had established a general delivery address at a nearby post office when she first arrived in town, a lifeline for a future that no longer existed. With her last few dollars, she took a bus, the faces of the other passengers, a blur of indifference. She didn't know what she was expecting. Nothing. And then she saw it. A thick, cream-colored envelope, its formality absurdly out of place among the junk mail and Social Security pamphlets. The return address was a law firm. Her first thought was that the DeLucas had found her, that they were suing her, that they had devised some new, fresh hell to visit upon her. Her hand trembled as she tore it open. The letter was not an attack, but a deliverance. It was from a lawyer in a small town she had left behind a decade ago. It informed her, in sterile legal prose, of the passing of her great-aunt Margaret, a woman she had spent one summer caring for as a teenager after she had broken her hip. Margaret, a reclusive woman with no children of her own, had been so grateful for Elena's gentle care that she had secretly amended her will, leaving the entirety of her modest estate to the one person who had shown her kindness at the end of her life. Enclosed was a certified check. It wasn't a fortune, not by DeLuca standards, but to Elena, it was the world. It was enough. She sat in a booth in a rundown diner, the check lying on the table next to a cup of black coffee she hadn't touched. She just stared at the number, at her own name printed on the paper. At first, the information didn't penetrate the fog of her grief. It was just an abstract fact. But then, a memory surfaced, clear and sharp. She remembered sitting with Aunt Margaret on her porch on a warm summer evening. The old woman had taken Elena's hand, her papery skin surprisingly strong. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, and a kind heart, child," Margaret had said, her voice raspy. "This world will try to chew you up and spit you out. Don't you let it. You're worth more than they'll ever tell you." That memory, that long-forgotten kindness, was the spark. It connected with the cold, hard reality of the check on the table and ignited something deep within her. The fog of grief began to burn away, not revealing warmth or light, but a landscape of pure, cold, incandescent rage. The tears she thought had run dry finally came, but they were different now. They were not tears of sorrow, but of fury. Hot, silent tears for the girl she had been, for the love she had believed in, and for the child she had lost. And as she cried, the pain began to change. It was no longer a weight. It was a whetstone. It was no longer a wound. It was a weapon. The shivering, broken girl in the motel room died in that diner. In her place, a woman made of ice and fire was born. Her first act was one of strategic rebirth. She left that town and never looked back. She traveled for 2 days, putting states between her and her past, until she arrived in a sprawling, anonymous metropolis where no one knew her name. And then she made sure no one ever would again. With a portion of the inheritance, she sought out the services of a discreet, expensive lawyer who specialized in new beginnings. She legally changed her name, choosing one that was strong, plain, and forgettable: Maya Reed. She got a new Social Security number, a new driver's license. She systematically and methodically erased every trace of Elena, the hopeful, naive maid. Elena was a ghost now, a fiction. Maya was a reality. Her new home was a small, Spartan apartment on the 14th floor of a concrete tower that overlooked a river of headlights. It was as sterile and impersonal as the motel room, but this was a chosen emptiness, a functional one. This was not a prison, it was a war room. She used the rest of her inheritance to fund her new singular purpose. She did not enroll in a university. That was too slow, too public. Instead, she embarked on a brutal, self-imposed education. Her days, which had once been measured by cleaning schedules and secret meetings, were now measured by chapters read and market trends analyzed. She devoured books on economics, corporate finance, securities law, and hostile takeovers. She subscribed to every major financial journal, her small apartment quickly filling with stacks of newspapers and magazines, their pages covered in her frantic, angry annotations. She learned the language of her enemy: leverage, derivatives, shorts, poison pills. The overheard conversations she had once dusted around in the DeLuca study now came back to her with a terrifying clarity. The names of companies, the whispers of deals, they were no longer just noise. They were data. They were the blueprints of the empire she now intended to burn to the ground. Her life became a monastic ritual of study and preparation. She lived on coffee and takeout, the sun rising and setting outside her window without her notice. The walls of her apartment were no longer bare. They were covered in a complex web of corporate structure charts, timelines of DeLuca Incorporated's acquisitions, and photographs of its board members, their faces pinned to the wall like targets. She wasn't just learning a subject, she was studying an enemy's anatomy, searching for its arteries, its pressure points, its hidden weaknesses. She was forging her mind into a weapon, sharpening it on the whetstone of her pain. She would not use the brute force of a bomb. She would use the surgical precision of a scalpel. She would use their own system, their own greed, their own immoral, money-obsessed world as the instrument of their destruction. One night, standing before her wall of research, she looked at the smiling, confident face of Julian DeLuca in a magazine clipping. She felt nothing. No love, no pain, not even a flicker of the girl who had once believed his lies. There was only a cold, calm, and absolute certainty. They had taken everything from her. Now, she was going to take everything from them. The flame of vengeance had been lit, and she would tend to it, nurture it, until it was a raging inferno. 5 years. 5 years is an eternity and an instant. For the DeLucas, it was a blur of successful quarters, lavish charity galas, and summer vacations in the Hamptons. Their world remained a fortress of gilded certainty. For Maya Reed, those same 5 years were a quiet, monastic, and brutal crucible. The world outside her window changed. Governments rose and fell, trends came and went, but her world had shrunk to the size of a bank of glowing monitors, her reality reduced to market data, corporate filings, and the slow, steady accumulation of capital. The frantic, grief-fueled student was gone, replaced by a disciplined, emotionless predator. Her small apartment had transformed into a high-tech command center, its walls a mosaic of stock charts and network diagrams. Sleep was a necessary inconvenience. Food was fuel. There was no joy, no pleasure, no distraction. There was only the mission. Her initial inheritance, the seed money from a dead woman's kindness, was her sacred trust. She didn't gamble with it. She nurtured it with a terrifying focus. Her first forays into the market were small, precise, and flawlessly researched. She specialized in finding the rot, the hidden weaknesses other investors overlooked. She'd spend weeks analyzing a single company, reading every line of its quarterly reports, studying its supply chain, learning the personalities of its executives. She became an expert at predicting failure. Her first significant victory came from a mid-level tech firm, a market darling whose stock was soaring. But Maya saw the truth in their balance sheets. They were over-leveraged, their profits were based on creative accounting, and their CEO had a history of making reckless promises. While everyone else was buying, Maya began to short the stock, a quiet bet against its success. When the inevitable scandal broke and the company's stock plummeted 90% in a single day, she didn't feel a thrill of victory. She felt a cold, quiet confirmation of her method. That single trade tripled her initial capital. She repeated the process again and again, each success building her war chest, each correct analysis sharpening her skills. With sufficient capital, she began to build her armor, absolute anonymity. The name Maya Reed existed only on a handful of legal documents. In the financial world, she did not exist. She created a labyrinthine corporate structure, a web of shell companies and holding firms with innocuous names like North River Holdings and Stonewater Equity Partners, registered in places like Delaware, the Cayman Islands, and Switzerland. Her instructions were funneled through layers of high-priced lawyers and brokers, intermediaries who were paid handsomely for their discretion and who never once saw her face or heard her unfiltered voice. She was an encrypted email, a distorted voice on a secure satellite phone, a ghost in the global machine of finance. Her greatest asset was not her growing fortune. It was the fact that, to the world, she was nobody. And then it was time. She turned her attention from the wider market to the singular object of her obsession, DeLuca Incorporated. Her first move was not a dramatic frontal assault, but a quiet act of infiltration. She instructed her network of brokers to begin buying DeLuca corporate debt, not their stock, but the bonds and loans issued by their various subsidiary companies. It was a slow, unglamorous process. One of her brokers, a man in Zurich, questioned the strategy. "The yield is stable, but low," he advised via secure message. "There are far more profitable places for your capital." Maya's reply was swift and cold. "Your job is not to analyze my strategy, it is to execute it. We are not investing in their success, we are investing in their obligations." The broker didn't understand. How could he? He saw it as a simple financial transaction. Maya saw it for what it was. She was becoming their creditor. She was inserting herself into their balance sheets, a cancer that they would not be able to see until it was far too late. With every bond she purchased, a small piece of their power, of their autonomy, was transferred to her. Her next move was to test their defenses. DeLuca Incorporated had a subsidiary in the pharmaceutical sector that was about to launch a promising new drug. The market was buzzing, and their stock price was climbing in anticipation. Maya, however, had spent months digging into the clinical trial data, using her obsessive research skills to find a flaw, a statistical anomaly in the reported side effects that the company's own PR team had successfully buried. She didn't go to the press or the regulators. That would be too noisy, too traceable. Instead, she had one of her anonymous entities commission a paper from an obscure but respected medical research group in Belgium, questioning the methodology of such trials. She then anonymously leaked that paper to an influential, niche financial blogger known for his skepticism. The blog post went viral within the investment community. It raised just enough doubt. Big investors got nervous. The stock, instead of soaring on the launch date, dipped. A wave of uncertainty forced the company to delay the launch to provide further data, a move that cost them millions and created a cloud of suspicion around their star product. The DeLucas, in their boardroom, cursed the blogger and the bad luck. It never occurred to them that the entire event was a single, deliberate, and perfectly executed act of sabotage. While she was chipping away at their finances, she began to attack their most valuable asset, their people. She created a database of every key executive, every brilliant researcher, every vital partner in the DeLuca ecosystem. She analyzed their careers, their frustrations, their ambitions. Her first target was a man named David Chen, the vice president of logistics at a major DeLuca manufacturing division. Chen was a genius of supply chain management, but he had been passed over for promotion twice in favor of men with better family connections. He was brilliant, undervalued, and resentful. Through Stonewater Equity Partners, Maya approached him. They didn't offer him a job, they offered him a kingdom. An email appeared in his personal inbox one day from an encrypted address. It laid out a plan to fund his own startup, a next-generation logistics company that would use the very ideas he had pitched to the DeLuca board, the ones they had dismissed as too radical. They offered him full creative control and a majority stake. After a week of secret, anonymous negotiations, David Chen resigned from DeLuca Incorporated, taking 2 of his best team members with him. The DeLucas were furious, but chalked it up to the disloyalty of modern employees. They were fighting individual fires, completely unaware that a single, invisible arsonist was patiently walking the perimeter of their empire, dousing its foundations with gasoline. They still slept soundly in their fortress, never knowing that the ghost of the girl they had tried to erase was now silently, patiently, and brilliantly laying the siege that would bring it all crashing down. The DeLucas, bloodied but unbowed, believed the worst was over. They had weathered a storm of bad luck and unforeseen market shifts. They had trimmed their budgets, fired a few executives as scapegoats, and presented a brave face to the world. Their paranoia had subsided into a state of resentful vigilance. In their minds, they had survived. It was this arrogance, this deep-seated belief in their own indestructibility, that made them the perfect victims for the masterfully crafted trap that was about to close. While they were congratulating themselves on their resilience, Maya Reed was initiating the final phase of her plan. For 5 years, she had been playing a game of inches, of whispers, of subtle manipulations. Now, it was time for a public execution. Her target was no longer a subsidiary or a partnership. It was the heart of the beast, DeLuca Incorporated itself. She knew she couldn't launch a takeover bid herself. Maya Reed was a ghost, and she had to remain one. She needed a proxy, a public face for her aggression. She needed a barbarian to storm the gates. She found him in Marcus Thorne, the CEO of Vanguard Corp., a notoriously ruthless corporate raider and a longtime rival of the DeLucas. From her anonymous, encrypted command center, Maya began to construct an irresistible temptation for Thorne. Through a series of untraceable messages funneled through a Swiss law firm, one of her shell companies, North River Holdings, made Thorne an offer. They had accumulated a significant, non-controlling stake in DeLuca Incorporated and had gathered a wealth of strategic intelligence. They believed the company was fundamentally undervalued and poorly managed, ripe for a takeover and restructuring. North River Holdings would provide the initial capital and the intelligence to support a hostile takeover bid, asking only for a generous return once the company was successfully acquired and broken up. To Thorne, it was the deal of a lifetime. All of the glory, with someone else providing the initial ammunition. He saw an opportunity to finally crush his old rival. He had no idea. He was merely a pawn, the finely sharpened blade in a hidden assassin's hand. The news broke on a Tuesday morning, flashing across every financial news network in the world. Vanguard Corp launches unexpected hostile takeover bid for DeLuca Incorporated. The announcement was a bombshell. In the DeLuca boardroom, chaos erupted. Julian, pale and shaken, stared at the television screen as if it were a death sentence. Board members were shouting, their faces a mixture of fear and fury. But above the din, Isabella's voice rose, not in panic, but in pure, unadulterated rage. "Never," she declared, her voice ringing with the iron of her will. "We will never sell. We will not be devoured by that vulture, Thorne. This company is not just a business, it is our name. It is our legacy. We will fight him with everything we have." For Isabella, this was not a financial negotiation. It was a war for the soul of her family. Her pride, the very thing that had made her so cruel, now made her fatally predictable. Driven by Isabella's defiance and his own desperate need to prove his strength, Julian led the charge to defend their empire. Their primary defense was a classic poison pill strategy. They would make the company prohibitively expensive for Vanguard to acquire. The plan was simple and suicidal. DeLuca Incorporated would take on a colossal amount of new debt to finance a massive stock buyback, purchasing their own shares from the open market at an inflated premium. This would consolidate their control and drive the acquisition price into the stratosphere. Julian got on the phone, scrambling to secure the massive lines of credit needed for the buyback. He called a consortium of banks and private equity firms, the old allies of his father's generation. And one by one, they agreed, offering him the loans he needed. He felt a surge of relief, a flicker of the old DeLuca power. He was so desperate, so blinded by the fight, that he never stopped to ask a simple question. Why was all this credit so readily available? He never knew that every friendly banker on the other end of the line, after hanging up with him, was making a second call to their true client, the quiet, anonymous entity that had been buying up their own debt for years and was now underwriting this final, fatal loan. He was borrowing from his own executioner. Maya was not just providing Vanguard with the sword, she was handing the DeLucas a poisoned shield. For 2 frantic weeks, the battle raged. The DeLucas burned through hundreds of millions of dollars, buying their own stock, their debt levels soaring to catastrophic heights. But it seemed to be working. The stock price was artificially inflated, and Vanguard's bid now looked untenable. On the day the buyback was completed, a tense, exhausted quiet fell over the DeLuca boardroom. They had done it. They were financially crippled, leveraged to the breaking point, but they were still independent. They had won. Julian allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. He had stared into the abyss and held his ground. Then the second news alert flashed across the screen. Vanguard Corp officially withdraws hostile takeover bid for DeLuca Incorporated, citing unsustainable valuation. A single, stunned gasp was heard in the boardroom. Chloe, who had been watching from the side, smiled. "We did it! We won!" she exclaimed. But Julian and Isabella just stared at the screen, a cold, sickening dread creeping into their hearts. They knew what it meant. And then they looked at the live stock ticker in the corner of the screen. The stock, which had been propped up by their own desperate buying, was no longer supported. The market, seeing Vanguard's withdrawal as a definitive sign that the company was a house of cards, reacted instantly. The ticker turned from green to red. The numbers began to fall. At first by cents, then by dollars. It was a landslide, a complete, catastrophic collapse. They were in a freefall, and they had cut their own parachute. The trap had been sprung. The silence in the room was broken by the ringing of Julian's phone. It was the lead banker from the consortium. Julian, the voice on the other end said, all friendliness gone, replaced by a cold formality. In light of the recent stock performance, the risk covenants on your new loans have been triggered. We're calling them in. Payment is due immediately. It was over. The company, with its worthless stock and its mountain of new debt, was insolvent. They couldn't pay. Chapter 11 bankruptcy was their only option. The life they knew was liquidated before their eyes. The lawyers and accountants descended, their quiet, somber work, a funeral procession for an empire. The corporate assets were seized by the creditors by Maya. Their personal fortunes, tied to the company's stock, vanished in an afternoon. The fleet of luxury cars was towed away. The private jet was repossessed. The art was taken from the walls. Everything was sold to pay the debts they had willingly, foolishly, taken on to save their pride. When the dust settled, only one thing remained: the ancestral mansion. Held in a century-old family trust, it was the last asset that could be used to satisfy the remaining creditors. And so, the final humiliation was delivered. A legal notice, followed by a large, professionally printed sign, was hammered into the lawn by the front gate, for sale by public auction. The stage for Maya's final act was now set.